The rain hammered against the window as I climbed halfway out of it, one leg over the sill, my heart slamming against my ribs. Going somewhere, Serena? I froze. Below me, standing in the dark with a glass of wine in his hand like he'd been expecting this exact moment, was Stefano Ricci. I was looking for the bathroom, I said, which was possibly the stupidest lie I had ever told in my entire life. He didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just looked up at me, completely calm, like a man who already knew how this story would end. Through the window, he said. Of course. That's where this all started to go, somewhere I never expected. But let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you know how a simple food delivery turned into the biggest mistake and maybe the best thing that ever happened to me. My name is Serena Bellini, and 3 months ago I was just trying to do my best friend a favor. Please, Serena, I'm begging you, Marisol said, shoving a paper bag of food into my arms behind the counter of her restaurant, Bella Vita. My delivery guy called in sick, the customer's already called twice, and I have a kitchen full of orders I can't leave. I have work in the morning, I said. It's one delivery. You drop it off, you come home, you sleep. 10 minutes, tops. I should have said no. I think about that a lot now, How different my life would be if I had just said no and gone home like a normal, sensible person. But Marisol had covered for me more times than I could count, and I owed her. So I took the bag, grabbed my keys, and told myself it really would only take 10 minutes. It did not take 10 minutes. The address she gave me led me down a road I didn't recognize, past streetlights that grew further and further apart until there weren't any at all. My phone, which had been sitting at 11% battery all day because I kept forgetting to charge it, finally gave up completely somewhere around a bend in the road that had no business existing on any map I'd ever seen. 1 second I had a blinking GPS arrow, the next I had a black screen and the sinking feeling that I was now completely, hopelessly lost. I kept driving because turning back felt worse than pushing forward. Eventually I saw lights ahead, not streetlights, but the warm glow of a massive house set back from an iron gate, with 2 men standing near it who were dressed far too well to just be gardeners. I didn't know it then, but I had just found Stefano Ricci's home. And he had never ordered a single thing from Bella Vita in his life. I pulled up to the gate, rolled down my window, and one of the men leaned in, studying me like I was a puzzle he hadn't been told to expect. Can I help you? He asked. I have a delivery, I said, lifting the paper bag like it was proof of something. For €1. I glanced at the receipt taped to the side. Ricci. The man exchanged a look with his partner that I didn't understand at the time but would come to recognize later as a very specific kind of look, the look people gave each other right before something interesting was about to happen. Wait here, he said, and disappeared through the gate. I sat there for what felt like forever, gripping the steering wheel, telling myself this was fine, this was normal, this was just a very fancy house that had ordered dinner. When the gate finally opened, I drove up a long driveway lined with trees, parked where I was told to park, and walked up to the front door with a paper bag of chicken parmesan and garlic bread like I was about to hand it to some tired businessman who'd forgotten to cook. The door opened before I even knocked. And there he was. Stefano Ricci was not what I expected, Not that I'd expected anything, because I had no idea who lived in this house. He was tall, dressed in a black shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, dark hair combed back, and he looked at me with an expression I couldn't read at all. Not surprise. Not confusion. Just curiosity, sharp and quiet, like he was deciding something about me before I'd even said a word. You must be from Bella Vita, he said. That's right. I held up the bag. Delivery for Ricci. That's me, he said. Except it wasn't. I know that now. He had never placed an order. He didn't even know a restaurant called Bella Vita existed. But in that moment, standing on his doorstep soaked from a light drizzle that hadn't yet turned into the storm that would trap me there, he looked at me and made a decision I wouldn't understand until much later. He decided to let me believe I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That'll be $32.50, I said, because I was still trying to be professional despite the fact that my hands were shaking slightly from the drive. He didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying me the way you'd study a painting you weren't sure you understood yet. You drove all the way out here yourself? My friend's delivery guy called in sick. I shifted my weight, suddenly aware of how out of place I looked standing in front of a house that had its own private gate and armed men who apparently thought nothing of guarding a food delivery. Is there a problem with the order? No, he said slowly. No problem at all. He reached for his wallet then, and I remember thinking it was strange that a man who lived in a house like this would carry cash instead of just tapping a card. But he counted out 2 crisp $100 bills and held them out to me. "I don't have change for that," I said. "I don't need change." "That's insane. It's a $32 order." "Then consider the rest a tip for finding your way out here in the dark," he said, and there was something in his voice, amusement maybe, or something closer to a challenge, that made me narrow my eyes at him. "I don't need charity," I said, more sharply than I probably should have to a man who was, for all I knew, some kind of executive or businessman who could have me thrown off his property with a single word. "It's not charity," he said. "It's payment for a service. You drove out here. You got lost, I'm guessing, based on how long it took you." His mouth curved slightly. "That's worth something." "How do you know I got lost?" "Because nobody finds this house by accident unless they take a wrong turn somewhere around the old mill road," he said. "And you have the look of someone who's been driving in circles for the last 20 minutes. I hated that he was right. I hated it even more that something about the way he said it made me want to laugh instead of leave. "Fine," I said, taking the money because arguing over it felt pointless and I was exhausted. "Thank you. I hope you enjoy your food." I turned to leave, and that's when the sky finally opened up. Not the light drizzle that had followed me the whole drive, but a real, heavy downpour that soaked through my jacket in seconds and turned the driveway into a river of rain in front of me. "You're not driving in that," Stefano said behind me. "I'll be fine," I said, already regretting the words as another gust of wind nearly knocked me sideways. "Serena." He said my name like he already owned it, like it was a fact he'd simply been informed of rather than something I'd have to tell him. I hadn't given him my name. It must have been on the receipt. I turned back around, water running down my face, and found him standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching me with an expression that wasn't pity, it was patience, like he already knew how this conversation would end and was simply waiting for me to catch up. "That road you came in on floods within 20 minutes of rain like this," he said. "I've seen cars get stuck out there for hours. Sometimes they don't get pulled out until morning. I'll take my chances. You could come inside, wait out the storm and leave once the road's clear. It's your choice." He shrugged like it truly didn't matter to him either way, though something in his eyes told me it did. "I'm simply telling you what I know about that road." I stood there in the rain, weighing my options, which were essentially drive off into a storm on a road I'd never been on and possibly get stranded somewhere far worse than a stranger's mansion, or go inside a stranger's mansion and hope he wasn't planning to murder me. Neither option was particularly appealing. "If I come in," I said, "it's only until the rain stops. Then I'm leaving." "Understood," he said, and stepped aside to let me through the door. I want to tell you I had some kind of premonition standing there, some sense that walking through that door was going to change the entire trajectory of my life. But the truth is, I just thought I was making the smart, safe choice. I had no idea I was walking into the home of one of the most powerful men in the city. I had no idea that the 2 men at the gate weren't security guards for a wealthy businessman. They were soldiers, loyal to a man whose name people said in hushed voices, a man whose family had run this city's underworld for 3 generations. All I knew was that he had kind eyes and an unsettling amount of confidence, and that my clothes were soaked through and I desperately wanted somewhere warm to sit down. The inside of the house was even more overwhelming than the outside: marble floors, dark wood furniture, paintings that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than someone's living room. A woman appeared almost instantly with towels, and I dried off as best I could while trying not to stare too obviously at everything around me. "You have quite the house," I said, because the silence was starting to feel heavy. "It was my father's," Stefano said. "And his father's before him." "Family money?" Something flickered across his face, amusement maybe at how naive the question was. "Something like that." He led me to a sitting room with a fireplace already lit, like the house had been ready for a guest even though I was certain no one had known I was coming. I sat on the edge of a leather chair, still clutching the empty delivery bag like it was some kind of security blanket, and watched him pour 2 glasses of wine without asking if I wanted one. "I don't really drink," I said when he held one out to me. "1 glass while you wait out a storm isn't drinking," he said. "It's just being polite to your host." I took the glass because arguing with him seemed to require more energy than I had left. "You're very confident for someone who just met me 20 minutes ago." Confidence isn't the same as being wrong, he said, sitting across from me with the kind of ease that told me he was completely comfortable in every room he ever walked into. You drove out to a stranger's house in the dark to deliver food, got lost, and instead of turning back the moment things went wrong, you kept going. That tells me you're either very brave or very stubborn. Maybe both. Maybe both, he agreed, and there it was again, that small curve of his mouth that made me feel like I was being studied rather than simply spoken to. What do you do? I asked, trying to steer the conversation somewhere that felt less like an interrogation of my personality. For work, I mean. To afford a house like this. Imports and exports, he said smoothly. Among other things. That's vague. It's accurate. I narrowed my eyes at him. Are you one of those guys who's secretly, like, in witness protection or something? For the first time he laughed, a real laugh, low and genuine, like I'd surprised him. No, he said. Nothing that dramatic. I didn't believe him, not entirely, but I let it go because I was tired and warm and the wine was actually quite good, and some small part of me was starting to enjoy the strange novelty of the evening despite myself. We talked for almost 2 hours while the storm raged outside. He asked about my life and I found myself telling him things I didn't usually share with people I'd just met, that I worked as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, that I'd grown up mostly on my own after my parents split when I was young, that I'd learned a long time ago that relying on other people usually just led to disappointment. That's a bleak way to live, he said. It's a safe way to live, I corrected. Is it working out for you? The question caught me off guard, mostly because I didn't have a good answer for it. I don't know what you mean. I mean, he said, leaning forward slightly, his eyes fixed on mine in a way that made my chest feel tight. Are you happy? Living the way you do, trusting no one, relying only on yourself. Is it working? I'm doing fine, I said, more defensively than I meant to. Fine isn't the same as happy, he said, and I didn't have a response to that because he was right, and I hated that a stranger I'd met 2 hours ago had already figured out something about me that most people in my life never bothered to notice. By the time the rain slowed to a drizzle, it was nearly 10 at night and I stood up, suddenly aware of how long I'd been sitting there talking to a man whose last name I barely knew. I should go, I said. The road's probably clear enough now. Stefano glanced toward the window, where the rain was still falling steadily even if it had eased slightly from the earlier downpour. It's not, he said. That road doesn't clear until the water has somewhere to drain, and with rain like this, that won't happen until morning. I really need to get home. You're welcome to stay the night, he said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. I have guest rooms. You'll be perfectly safe and you can leave first thing in the morning when the road's clear. Every instinct I had told me this was a terrible idea. You do not stay the night at a stranger's mansion, no matter how nice his wine is or how disarming his laugh sounds. But when I looked out the window at the rain still coming down in sheets, and thought about my car getting stuck somewhere on a dark, flooded road with no phone to call for help, staying suddenly felt like the more rational choice. Fine, I said. But only because of the road. Not because, I gestured vaguely between us. Not because of anything else. Of course, he said, and I couldn't tell if the amusement in his voice was because he found me funny or because he already knew something I didn't. He showed me to a guest room down a long hallway lined with more paintings, told me to let the housekeeper know if I needed anything, and left me alone with a strange, unsettled feeling in my chest that I refused to name. I did not trust him. That was the thought I kept coming back to as I sat on the edge of the enormous bed, still in my damp clothes, looking around the room like I expected to find hidden cameras or some other proof that this whole evening was some kind of trap. Rich men who lived behind iron gates with armed guards did not simply let strange delivery girls stay the night out of the goodness of their hearts. There was something he wasn't telling me, and every year of my life had taught me that when something felt too smooth, too convenient, it usually was. So around 10 o'clock, once the house had gone quiet, I made my decision. I wasn't going to wait until morning like some obedient guest. I was going to leave now on my own terms, before anyone woke up and decided I wasn't allowed to. The window in my room looked out over a side garden, close enough to the ground that I figured I could climb down without too much trouble, sneak around to where my car was parked and be gone before anyone noticed. It was reckless. It was probably unnecessary given that I could have simply walked out the front door. But some part of me, the part that had spent years avoiding anything that felt like a trap, needed to leave quietly, invisibly, on my own terms. I pushed the window open as quietly as I could, swung one leg over the sill, and had just started lowering myself down when a voice from below made my entire body freeze. Going somewhere, Serena? And that's the moment you already know about. Stefano stood in the garden below, a glass of wine in hand, looking up at me with an expression that told me he had been expecting exactly this. I was looking for the bathroom, I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I knew how absurd they sounded. Through the window, he repeated, not laughing, though I could see the effort it took him not to. I got turned around, I said, trying to salvage what little dignity I had left as I awkwardly climbed back through the window instead of finishing my descent, my face burning with embarrassment. This house is very big. It is, he agreed, and a few minutes later he appeared at my door with a small smile that told me he wasn't buying a single word of my story but had decided, for reasons of his own, not to call me out on it directly. The bathroom, he said, is actually just down the hall. Third door on the left. Right, I said. Good to know. Serena. He leaned against the doorframe, studying me with that same patient curiosity from earlier. If you wanted to leave, all you had to do was ask. I would have told you the road wasn't safe and you could have made your own decision. There was no need to climb out a window. I didn't want to bother anyone. You didn't trust me, he said simply, and I hated how accurately he'd read the situation. That's fine. I understand. You don't know me. But climbing out of windows in the middle of a storm isn't safer than simply talking to me. I crossed my arms, embarrassment quickly turning into defensiveness. You have to admit this whole situation is strange. A man like you letting a stranger stay the night, acting like it's completely normal. Is it so strange to want to be a decent host? In my experience, yes. Something shifted in his expression, not offense, but a kind of quiet understanding, like he recognized the wall I kept building between us and had decided, rather than trying to knock it down, he would simply wait for me to lower it myself. Get some rest, he said instead of arguing further. The road will be clear by morning. I'll have someone check on it at dawn and you'll be free to go whenever you're ready. No windows required. He left and I sat on that bed for a long time afterward, replaying the conversation, annoyed at myself for feeling embarrassed and even more annoyed at the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had settled in my chest despite everything. I left the next morning just as he promised, the road clear, the storm having passed completely. Stefano walked me to my car himself, his hands in his pockets, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Thank you for the hospitality, I said, feeling oddly formal about the whole thing. And I'm sorry about the window. Don't be, he said. It was the most interesting thing that's happened in this house in months. I laughed despite myself. I'm glad my embarrassment could entertain you. It wasn't your embarrassment I found entertaining, he said, and something in the way he looked at me made my stomach flip in a way I didn't have time to examine before I was in my car, backing out of the driveway, telling myself firmly that I would never see this strange, wealthy, unsettling man again. I was wrong. 2 weeks passed before I heard from him. I'd almost convinced myself the entire night had been some kind of strange dream. A story I'd tell at parties someday about the time I accidentally delivered food to a mansion and spent the night arguing with its owner about windows and trust. Then Marisol handed me an envelope at the restaurant, her eyebrows raised so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. Someone dropped this off for you, she said. By hand. A man in a very expensive suit. Inside was a single card, handwritten in elegant, careful script. Serena, I believe you left before I could properly thank you for the delivery, wrong address and all. Dinner this Friday if you're willing. If not, I understand. Either way, I hope the drive home was less eventful than the one that brought you to me. Stefano. I read it 4 times before I looked up at Marisol, who was watching me with barely contained curiosity. Who is this guy, she asked. And why does he write like he's from a different century? I have no idea, I admitted, though that wasn't entirely true anymore. I'd asked around after that night, carefully, casually, the way you do when you don't want to admit how curious you actually are. And what I'd found had unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Stefano Ricci wasn't just a wealthy man with a big house. People said his name carefully, like it carried weight, like it was attached to things they didn't want to discuss openly. Import and export, he told me, and in a way I suppose that was true if you counted the things people whispered about in low voices when his name came up in conversation. I should have thrown the card away. Every rational part of me knew that a man surrounded by that kind of reputation was not someone I should be having dinner with, no matter how genuinely he'd laughed at my terrible lie about the bathroom. Instead, I found myself standing in front of my closet on Friday evening, trying to decide what you wear to dinner with a man who might or might not be involved in something dangerous. Dinner was at a small, quiet restaurant, not the mansion which I appreciated more than I let on. Stefano was already seated when I arrived, standing as I approached the table in a gesture that felt almost old-fashioned. "You came," he said. "I was curious," I admitted. "Mostly about why a man like you would go through the trouble of finding a delivery girl just to invite her to dinner. Would you believe me if I said I simply enjoyed our conversation?" "Not entirely, no." He smiled at that like my skepticism was somehow the correct answer. "Fair enough. I'll tell you the truth then. I don't meet many people who speak to me the way you did that night. Most people who come to my house are either afraid of me or trying to get something from me. You were neither." "I didn't know who you were," I said. "That probably had something to do with it. And now that you do?" I studied him for a long moment, weighing how honest to be. "Now I know that people talk about you like you're someone to be careful around. And yet you're here." "And yet I'm here," I agreed, unable to fully explain even to myself why that was true. Dinner stretched long into the evening, our conversation moving easily between topics. His years spent partly abroad as a younger man, my complicated relationship with my mother, books we'd both read, cities we'd both wanted to visit but never had. He was infuriatingly easy to talk to, funny in a dry, understated way I hadn't expected, and attentive in a manner that made me feel like the only person in the room, which I later learned was a skill he'd cultivated deliberately, though in those early days it simply felt genuine. "Can I ask you something?" I said halfway through dessert, emboldened by the wine and the ease of the evening. "The things people say about you. The whispers. Is any of it true?" Something in his expression shifted, careful and measured, like a man deciding how much of a door to open. "What have you heard? That your family has been involved in things for generations. That people don't cross you because they're afraid of what happens if they do." He was quiet for a moment, turning his wine glass slowly by its stem. "My family has a long history in this city," he said finally. "Not all of it clean. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. But I'm not going to sit here and confirm every rumor either, because most of what people whisper is exaggerated, and the rest is none of their business." "That's not exactly reassuring." "I never said it would be," he said, meeting my eyes directly. "I could lie to you, Serena. I could tell you I'm simply a businessman with an overactive imagination attached to my name. But I'd rather you know at least partially what you're dealing with, than have you find out later and feel like I deceived you." I appreciated the honesty even as it unsettled me further. "Why does it matter what I think you are?" "Because I find that I care," he said simply, and the quiet sincerity in his voice caught me off guard more than anything else he'd said all evening. That dinner became several dinners over the following weeks. Each time I told myself it would be the last, that I would see him once more, satisfy my curiosity, and then walk away before things became complicated. Each time I found a reason to say yes to the next invitation instead. He was patient in a way that unnerved me, never pushing, never demanding more than I was willing to give. When I pulled back, uncertain, he simply waited, giving me space without disappearing entirely, sending the occasional message that required nothing from me except an honest response. I saw glimpses of his world during those weeks that I couldn't ignore no matter how much I wanted to. A dinner interrupted by a phone call that made his expression go cold and sharp in a way I hadn't seen before. Men who greeted him in the street with a deference that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with fear. A night when he canceled our plans abruptly, and I later heard, through channels I didn't fully understand, that there had been trouble somewhere in the city, trouble that people connected in hushed voices to his name. "You don't have to tell me everything," I said to him one evening, weeks into whatever this had become, as we sat on the terrace of his house watching the sunset. "But I need you to be honest about what I'm walking into if this continues. What do you want to know? Is it dangerous? Being close to you?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, not rushing to reassure me the way I half expected him to. "Yes," he said finally. "It could be. I won't pretend otherwise. There are people who would use you against me if they knew you mattered to me. I've thought about that every day since I met you, and some nights I think the responsible thing would be to let you go, to make sure you never have to know that kind of risk. But you haven't. No, he admitted. I haven't. Because the truth is, Serena, I don't want to let you go. I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who either fear me or want something from me. And then a woman showed up at my door with the wrong food order and looked at me like I was just a man, nothing more, nothing less. I don't know how to walk away from that, even knowing what it might cost. I didn't say anything for a long moment, watching the last light fade over the hills beyond his property, feeling the weight of everything he'd just admitted settle over me. I'm scared, I said finally, and it was the first time I'd admitted that kind of vulnerability to anyone in years. Not of you. Of how much I've started to feel this fast for someone whose world I don't fully understand. I'm not asking you to understand all of it tonight, he said quietly. I'm asking you to decide if you want to keep learning. I looked at him, then really looked at him, past the reputation, past the danger, past every rational reason I had to walk away, and found the answer already sitting in my chest, waiting for me to admit it. Yes, I said. I want to keep learning. The months that followed weren't easy. There were nights he disappeared without explanation, leaving me anxious and awake, imagining every terrible possibility. There were conversations we had, careful and honest, about what it meant to build a life alongside a man whose world operated by different rules than the one I'd always known. There were moments I doubted everything, moments I nearly walked away entirely, convinced that loving him was a mistake I couldn't afford. But there were also mornings I woke up in that same guest room, no longer a guest, watching him move through his own house with a quiet ease that had nothing to do with the reputation that followed his name outside those walls. There were evenings we spent simply talking, the way we had that very first night when I still believed I'd never see him again. There were moments he looked at me like I was the only safe thing in an otherwise dangerous life, and I understood slowly that he needed me the same way I'd come to need him. I learned to trust him, not blindly, not completely, but genuinely, in the way you trust someone you've watched be honest with you even when honesty cost him something. I learned that beneath the reputation was a man who was patient with my guardedness, who never once tried to force his way past the walls I'd built, who waited instead for me to open the door myself. And somewhere in the middle of all those months, between the danger and the doubt and the slow, careful building of trust, I fell in love with him, completely, terrifyingly, in a way I'd spent my entire life avoiding. It was a quiet evening, almost a year after that storm first trapped me at his door, when he found me in the same sitting room where we'd first talked for hours, the fireplace lit exactly as it had been that night. "Do you remember what you said to me," he asked, "when I told you the road wasn't safe to drive on?" "I said I'd take my chances," I said, smiling at the memory. "And then you tried to climb out a window at 10 o'clock at night to avoid me," he said, and I laughed, the embarrassment of that night having long since faded into something fond. In my defense, I really did think I was in danger. "You were," he said, and something in his tone made me look up at him more carefully. "Just not in the way you thought." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He was quiet for a moment, considering something, and then he said simply, "I knew you had the wrong address the moment you handed me that bag, Serena. I never ordered any food in my life. I let you believe otherwise because I wanted an excuse to keep you talking to me a little longer." I stared at him, the pieces of that first night rearranging themselves in my mind. "You're joking." "I'm not. You let me stand there thinking I'd found the right house, took my order, paid for food you never asked for, and then let me stay the night, all because you found me interesting?" "Yes," he said without a trace of apology. "I've never regretted a single decision more than I regretted almost letting you drive away that night, wrong address and all. I should have been angry. Some part of me was briefly at the sheer audacity of it. But mostly sitting there in that same firelit room a year later, I found myself laughing, really laughing, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and unguarded, because of course, the whole thing had started with a lie, however small, however well-intentioned. Of course, the man who'd spent a year being patient and honest with me had started our entire story by letting me believe something that wasn't true. "You're impossible," I said, still laughing. "I'm consistent," he corrected, pulling me closer. "I told you that first night confidence isn't the same as being wrong. You were wrong about the food order. I was right about everything else." I couldn't argue with that, not really, not after a year of watching him prove it night after night, choice after choice. "So," I said, settling against him, the fire crackling softly in front of us, "what happens now?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard from him before, careful and deliberate in a way that made my chest tighten with anticipation. "Now," he said, "I suppose I finally place an order of my own."